She was an orphan, exiled, invisible to the world, but heaven had already chosen her name. When an entire empire was preparing to exterminate her people, God was silently moving the pieces. And the most unlikely piece was a woman named Esther. The key story of Esther unfolds during a dark period for the Jewish people. They were far from home, far from Jerusalem, far from the temple, far from the altar. The Babylonian exile had scattered the tribes, and now many Jews lived under the rule of the Persian Empire, the most powerful on earth. Most had adapted to the new culture. Some hid their faith, others tried to keep alive the flame of God's covenant. But one thing was certain: the days were hard. The promises of glory seemed distant, and many asked, "Is God still with us?" And it is in this exact setting that the story of Esther begins, one of the most intriguing books in the Bible, and the only one that does not directly mention the name of God. But ironically, it is also the book where his hand is most visible behind the scenes. The narrative is set in the city of Susa, one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. It was there that the royal palace stood, where King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as he is also known in secular history, reigned, a king with authority over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. We are talking about a colossal power structure, where unchangeable laws were decreed with the king's seal, and a single word could mean life or death. It is in this environment that a young woman named Hadassah emerges, her Hebrew name. But among the Persians, she was known as Esther. Esther was no ordinary woman. Though the world did not know her name, heaven had already set apart her mission. She was Jewish. Orphaned at a young age, raised by her cousin Mordecai, a man of integrity and faith who treated her like a daughter. They both lived in Susa, trying to survive cultural oppression without losing their spiritual identity. Esther's childhood was not marked by privilege. She grew up between two worlds, being taught to trust in the God of Israel while living under the demands of a pagan culture. Yet she carried within her a rare beauty and a quiet faith that would soon echo throughout the empire. One of the deepest beauties of the book of Esther is precisely its silence. There are no visions, no angels, no prophets, no supernatural miracles take place in human sight, but there is something more powerful than all of that: divine providence. A series of coincidences so perfectly aligned that only God could orchestrate them. When it seems like God is silent, he is actually operating with surgical precision. And that's exactly what he did, starting by bringing down a queen. Sometimes we think that God's silence is abandonment. But Esther shows us that his silence is strategy, that when nothing seems to be happening, he is aligning everything, using even exile, grief, and humiliation for a greater purpose. You may be in exile right now, but God knows exactly where you are. He has not forgotten you. And it was at a banquet soaked in wine and vanity that the first domino fell. Queen Vashti refused to obey a public order from the king, and without realizing it, she opened the way for an unknown orphan to be chosen by God to change the destiny of a nation. The book of Esther opens with a clear picture of who King Ahasuerus was: a powerful man, but vain; proud, yet vulnerable to flattery; a king who used banquets to display his strength, but whose most important decisions were made under the influence of wine. He ruled over a colossal empire, and like an emperor of his time, he decided to display his dominion in grandeur. He organized an enormous celebration, a 180-day banquet. That's right, half a year of non-stop feasting, with governors, princes, military leaders, and the most influential men from all the provinces. It was more than a social event. It was a political move. The king wanted to reaffirm his glory and solidify alliances. The Bible describes the courtyard where the celebration took place as a magnificent place. There were hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords, of fine linen and purple on silver rings and marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Esther 1:6. It was the perfect setting to impress, but also fertile ground for hasty decisions. Right after the 180 days of official feasting, the king hosted an additional 7-day banquet just for the people of the city of Susa. Nothing seemed enough to satisfy his inflated ego. During this second banquet, at the height of his drunken euphoria, Ahasuerus made a mistake. He ordered his wife, Queen Vashti, to appear before the men wearing the royal crown, to display her beauty. The Bible doesn't go into detail about how this was said, but the context indicates that it was a humiliating display. He wanted to make his wife into a trophy before his guests, and then something unexpected happened. Vashti refused to obey, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Therefore the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him. Esther 1:12. Vashti's refusal was more than a personal act. In that culture, it was seen as a threat to social order. If the queen disobeyed the king, other women might follow her example. The structural machismo of that era would not allow such a precedent to stand. The king's advisors quickly warned him, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the princes and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women. Esther 1:16-17. So based on this threat to male authority, the princes suggested an exemplary punishment, the removal of her royal title and her replacement. Ahasuerus agreed, and so Vashti was banished from the king's presence, and from the biblical narrative, what seemed like a simple marital crisis would become the launching point for God's plan. Vashti's fall prepared the throne for Esther, and look how remarkable this is. Neither Esther, nor Mordecai, nor the Jewish people were involved at that moment. God was acting without anyone knowing. Like an invisible author, he was already writing the next scene of salvation. Vashti stepped out so that a nameless orphan could step in. Divine sovereignty works like this. Even when everything feels like chaos, he is still in control. Many times we see doors closing and think it's the end. But maybe God is just removing what occupies the place of his promise. When something falls, God has already prepared who will rise, just as Esther had no idea what she was about to live. You too may be only a few steps away from God's purpose for your life, even if today it still feels insignificant. With Vashti's fall, the king and his counselors issued a new decree, that all the most beautiful young women of the empire be brought to the palace. A nationwide search for a new queen began, and among thousands of candidates was a quiet, unknown young woman, yet chosen by God before the foundation of the world. With Vashti removed, the throne was vacant, and the king's advisors moved quickly. A new decree would be sent out across the empire. The plan was clear. Beautiful virgins would be selected from all 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. Each one would be brought to the royal harem in Susa. There, they would undergo a rigorous preparation process before being presented to the king, who would choose one of them as the new queen of Persia. This decision wasn't just political, it was historical, and unknowingly, the Persians themselves were making room for God to place a Jewish woman on the most powerful throne on earth. Far from the palace lights, in an ordinary neighborhood of Susa, lived a young woman named Hadassah. Orphaned of both father and mother, she had been raised by her cousin Mordecai. Her Persian name was Esther, and her beauty was remarkable, but it wasn't just that which made her special. Esther was humble, reserved, wise, and above all, God-fearing. She, had no idea her life was about to change forever when the king's officers knocked on her door. Her appearance drew attention, but it would be her quiet faith that would capture heaven's favor. The royal harem was a world of its own. Each young woman selected had to go through 12 months of treatments before being presented to the king, 6 months with myrrh oil and 6 with perfumes and refined cosmetics. Each young woman had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments as prescribed for the women. Esther 2:12. It wasn't just about appearance. It was a meticulous system of refinement, discipline, and observation. Everything was overseen by Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem, and it was there that Esther shone without trying. She did not demand privileges. She didn't try to stand out, and yet she gained Haggai's favor more than anyone else. Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Esther 2:15. God's grace is silent but irresistible. Esther didn't use tricks or try to manipulate the system. Her beauty was accompanied by character, wisdom, and reverence for the Lord. She followed Haggai's guidance and did not reveal her nationality, just as Mordecai had instructed. And without anyone knowing, God was about to place his servant on the most unlikely throne on earth. At last, the day arrived. Esther would be presented to the king. She didn't ask for luxurious dresses or extravagant jewels. She simply followed what Haggai advised. And that was enough. When King Ahasuerus saw her, his heart was moved. Among all the women in the empire, none pleased him as much as she did. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. Esther 2:17. Ahasuerus placed the royal crown on her head and proclaimed Esther Queen of Persia. The coronation was celebrated with a great feast, the Feast of Esther. The king granted gifts to the governors, tax relief to the people, and declared a holiday. It looked like a human celebration, but it was the divine confirmation of a meticulously designed plan. God had placed a Jewish orphan on the highest throne on earth. And no one knew, not the king, nor his counselors, nor the enemies of the Jews. Only heaven knew that deliverance was on the way. If this story is touching you, leave a comment. God can position me wherever he wants. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel Knowing the Word yet, now is the time. Here, every Bible story comes to life in a deep and powerful way. Click now and turn on the bell. You'll see the Bible like never before. Maybe you are going through a season of anonymity, of silent preparation, of long processes. But know this. When God wants to raise you up, he can use even imperial decrees to place you where you never imagined being. Esther was taken to the throne, without knowing that her mission wasn't to be queen, it was to be an intercessor. The throne was only the path. The purpose was still to come. While Esther celebrated her new position, the palace began to change. A new man rose to power alongside the king. His name, Haman, and with him came the most terrifying threat against God's people since the exile. An invisible war was about to begin. Esther was now queen. The celebrations were over, the crown had been placed, and the people of Persia rejoiced in the new sovereign chosen by Ahasuerus. But inside her, nothing had changed. She was still a Jewish woman in exile, with a soul shaped by fasting, by prayer, and by the faith taught by Mordecai. Even while in the palace, Esther never forgot who she was, or who had formed her. She knew that behind the golden necklaces and fine linen robes, there was a greater purpose. She just didn't yet know what it was. Mordecai, though outside the palace, remained close. He spent his days at the royal gate, watching attentively, wanting to know how Esther was doing. A common man, yet with a sharp sense of mission. It was there, within the palace walls, that Mordecai happened to overhear a conversation that would change everything. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, were plotting to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The reason for the conspiracy is not clear in the text, but the intention was deadly: to kill the king. Mordecai immediately sent word to Esther. She, in turn, informed the king, in Mordecai's name. The officials were investigated, and the plot was confirmed. The conspirators were executed, and Mordecai's heroic act was recorded in the royal chronicles of Persia. But something curious happened. Mordecai was not rewarded. Nothing. No honor. No gift, no promotion, only silence. But that silence was part of God's strategy. He was simply postponing the reward for the right moment. When God's justice seems delayed, it's because he's preparing the stage for it to be complete. Meanwhile, Esther kept her Jewish identity a secret, just as Mordecai had instructed from the beginning. She followed his guidance with wisdom. Even in the midst of royalty, she could have felt safe. She could have used her position to show off or to promote her cause, but she waited for God's timing. Because the crown she wore was not just a symbol of glory, it was a reminder that her mission had not yet begun. Sometimes we think the miracle has already happened when God says yes. But many times the yes is only the beginning of a much greater process. Esther was crowned, but her greatest mission was still hidden behind the victory. Learn to wait in silence, to trust the timing, and not to rush the process. Because God only reveals purpose at the right time. The Bible remains silent about Esther's actions for quite some time after her coronation. What does this tell us? That there are seasons when God positions us, but hides us. That there are moments when he lifts us up, only to prepare us in secret. Esther doesn't appear again in the narrative for a while, but that didn't mean God had stopped acting. It was the silence before the battle. In the next chapter of the story, a new figure will emerge. A man who will be promoted to second in command of the empire, and with him will come the most wicked decree ever issued against God's people. That man was Haman, and while Esther enjoyed the king's favor, the throne was beginning to be poisoned by pride, ambition, and hatred disguised as loyalty. When God positions his children, the enemy moves too. And that's when the real battles begin. In the next block you'll meet Haman, the man who planned the genocide of the Jewish people, and how God was already preparing the counterattack before the threat even appeared. While Esther was adjusting to palace life, and Mordecai remained watchful at the gates, a new character began to rise: Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. The Bible doesn't spend many verses explaining who he was, but there are powerful clues in his lineage. Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of Agag, king of the Amalekites. And who were the Amalekites? Longtime enemies of God's people. Since the days of Exodus, they had tried to destroy the Israelites in the wilderness. Saul had been commanded by God to destroy Agag, but spared him. And now, generations later, Agag's lineage returned, thirsting for vengeance against the Jews. In other words, what seemed like a political issue was in truth an ancient spiritual war, reignited in the halls of power. For reasons not detailed in the biblical text, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman to a position above all other princes. He became the king's right hand. With this authority, Haman demanded absolute respect. He decreed that all of the king's servants must bow down before him, and everyone obeyed, except one man, Mordecai. All the king's officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Esther 3:2. Mordecai refused to bow, not out of political rebellion but out of spiritual conviction. He knew that bowing to Haman, a man descended from Israel's enemies, would violate his principles. Other officials tried to convince Mordecai day after day to comply, but he stood firm, and when Haman found out, he exploded in rage. But Haman's hatred went beyond Mordecai. He decided that it wasn't enough to destroy that one man. He wanted to annihilate the entire Jewish people throughout the empire. Haman devised a calculated, cold plan. He cast Pur, meaning lot, to determine the date of the massacre. The chosen date was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then, with carefully crafted words, Haman presented his plan to the king. He described the Jews as a distinct people, scattered throughout the empire, with dangerous laws of their own. There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Esther 3:8. Haman offered an outrageous sum of silver to the royal treasury in exchange for authorization to exterminate the Jews. And the king, fully trusting Haman, handed over his royal signet ring, the symbol of supreme authority, and allowed him to write the decree as he pleased. Haman wasted no time. An official decree was drafted and sent via messengers to every province in the Persian Empire. Its content was terrifying. All Jews, young and old, children and women, were to be killed on a single day. Their possessions would be looted. No mercy would be shown. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day. Esther 3:13. Imagine the terror, the pain, the feeling of abandonment. The Jews, scattered across 127 provinces, were now officially condemned by the government, and there was no way out. As the Jewish people began to mourn in desperation, the city of Susa fell into confusion, but the king and Haman sat down to drink wine. The contrast is shocking. A genocidal decree had just been signed, and the two top leaders of the empire were quietly celebrating. How often does it seem that the wicked prosper while the faithful are persecuted? How often do the structures of power appear to move against the children of God? But the story of Esther reminds us, man's sentence is never the final word when God hasn't spoken yet. Haman wrote death, but God had already written deliverance. When Mordecai learned about the decree, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went to the palace gate, crying out in pain and urgency. It was time to act, but the only person who could speak to the king was someone who had hidden her identity until now. And now she had to reveal herself or die trying. The news of Haman's decree quickly reached all the provinces. But in Susa, where Mordecai and Esther lived, the impact was immediate and devastating. When Mordecai learned of the coming tragedy, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and covered himself in ashes, the signs of the deepest mourning in the Hebrew world. He walked through the city, crying out loudly, wailing at the gates of the palace, where no one was allowed to enter, dressed in mourning clothes. And in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther 4:3. The Jewish people were being pushed to the edge of the abyss, and their last resort was to cry out to the God who seemed silent. Isolated in the palace, surrounded by the routines of royalty, Esther still didn't know about the decree. When her maids informed her that Mordecai was dressed in sackcloth, crying at the gates, she was alarmed. She sent him new clothes, trying to comfort him. But Mordecai refused. This wasn't about appearance, it was about urgency. Esther then sent her trusted servant Hathach to find out what was happening. Through Hathach, Mordecai sent a copy of the death decree along with a clear request. Go to the king, intercede, ask for mercy, use your position to save our people. That was it. The moment had come. What had so far been a story of beauty, grace, and honor was now becoming a story of decision, sacrifice, and faith. Upon receiving the message, Esther replies sincerely, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the law is the same. They are to be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them. And I have not been called to the king for the last 30 days." Esther 4:11. In other words, she would have to risk her own life. If she entered and the king did not welcome her, she would be executed. And the king was distant, removed, silent. Just as God seemed to be, Mordecai's reply is one of the strongest speeches in the Bible. He shatters any sense of comfort and reminds Esther of who she is and of the God who called her. "Do not think that because you are in the king's house you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther 4:13-14. There Mordecai reveals his confidence. God will save his people. The only question is, will Esther be the instrument or a bystander? It's as if he were saying, "You are there because God put you there. But what will you do with this position?" After hearing these words, Esther is transformed. Something shifts in her spirit. Fear gives way to faith. Hesitation gives way to courage. And the queen becomes an intercessor. "Go, gather together, all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Esther 4:16. This is one of the most powerful declarations in Scripture. Esther understands if her life isn't being used to fulfill God's purpose, it's not worth protecting. She chooses to surrender everything, the fame, the comfort, the throne, her very life. During those 3 days of fasting, the people of Susa pray, weep, and cry out. Esther prepares, not only with royal garments, but with a broken spirit. She does not go as queen, she goes as a servant of God. Because whoever stands before the King of men with the backing of the King of kings never stands alone. How many times has God placed you in positions you don't understand? How often have you faced something too big, too hard, too dangerous? The story of Esther shows us that the greatest victories begin when we stop fighting for ourselves and start fighting for others. If God placed you where you are, it's not by accident. Your position, your voice, your influence, your pain, everything can be used by him to save lives. 3 days passed. The fast ended. And Esther, dressed in her royal robes, entered the inner court of the palace without being summoned. Her life depended on a gesture, a scepter, a look, and then the king saw her. For 3 days and nights, the city of Susa experienced something unusual. There were no feasts, no dinners, no laughter, only silence, groans, and prayers. While the people fasted, cried out, and waited for an invisible intervention, Esther fasted too. She, the palace maids, and the entire Jewish community united in a chain of faith like never before. There, the palace that housed luxury and power became a place of spiritual warfare. The queen didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't plot political plans. She fasted, because she knew that heaven's throne only moves through total surrender. On the 3rd day, Esther rose. The fast ended, but the tension only grew stronger. She chose her royal robes, not just any garment, but the symbol of her authority. She dressed not only as Queen of Persia, but as the ambassador of an invisible people, and as the intercessor of an eternal covenant. She knew She was going to meet an earthly king, but carried within her the mission of the King of Kings. Every step Esther took through the palace corridors echoed in heaven. Every foot closer to the throne room was an act of faith, courage, and absolute dependence on divine mercy. The scene is one of the most solemn in all of Scripture. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. Esther 5:1. There she was, alone, her heart racing, her soul surrendered, the destiny of thousands in her hands. It was forbidden to enter that place without being summoned. It was a death sentence. Now everything depended on a single gesture. King Xerxes lifted his eyes. He saw Esther from a distance. The scene may have lasted seconds, but for her, it was an eternity. And then he extended the golden scepter. The king extended the gold scepter that was in his hand to Esther, so she approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Esther 5:2. What could have been death turned into mercy. The door opened, the king's heart softened, and heaven began to move the invisible threads of salvation. Xerxes, enchanted by her, asked, "What is it you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Esther 5:3. But Esther revealed nothing. She didn't act in haste, nor by impulse. With wisdom, she extended an invitation. "If it pleases the king, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." Esther 5:4. She planted the seed of revelation. She didn't confront Haman right away. She waited for the exact moment, like someone who knows she's being guided by God. Haman, full of pride, took the invitation as an honor. A banquet just for him and the king. That only inflated his ego even more. At the banquet, the king asked again, "What is your request, Queen Esther? It will be granted." And once again, she delayed. "If I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Esther 5:8. Esther didn't hesitate out of fear. She hesitated with strategy, because she knew the revelation had to happen at the perfect time. How many times has God asked you not to speak yet? To wait. Esther teaches us that wisdom is knowing when to act, when to speak, and when to be silent. God doesn't work with anxiety. He works with purpose. And what is being prepared in secret will be revealed in glory at the right moment. While Esther waited for the perfect moment, Haman left the banquet in high spirits. But as he passed through the palace gates, he saw Mordecai again, and the hatred flared back up. Mordecai would not bow. Filled with rage, Haman returned home and was encouraged by his family to build a gallows 75 feet high for Mordecai. He accepted the suggestion and decided that the next day he would ask the king for permission to have him executed. Little did he know that gallows would become the stage of his own downfall. That very night, the king could not sleep. He was restless. He ordered the royal records to be brought and read to him. And as he listened to a long-forgotten portion of history, the name of Mordecai was mentioned. While the enemy was plotting his death, God was already beginning to exalt the one he wanted to destroy. The Bible says that on that night, after Esther's first banquet, King Xerxes couldn't sleep. It might seem like a random detail, but in stories guided by heaven, not a single comma is by accident. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. Esther 6:1. Xerxes could have asked for music, wine, another banquet, but something troubled him. His sleep was taken by God, because the time had come to remember what had been forgotten. The book of the Chronicles was opened, and a specific event was read, the time Mordecai discovered and reported a conspiracy by two eunuchs who were plotting to assassinate the king. The event had been recorded, but Mordecai had never been rewarded. Surprised, the king asked, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" The answer came, "Nothing has been done for him." At that moment, something stirred. In the king's heart, he decided to honor that faithful man, and not just with words, but with public recognition. While the king was still thinking about how to honor Mordecai, Haman entered the outer court of the palace, eager to request Mordecai's execution. But before he could speak, the king called him. "Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Esther 6:6. Haman, filled with ego, thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" And then he described the most extravagant honor he could imagine. Have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Esther 6:7-9. The king then replied, "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Esther 6-10. Imagine the scene. Haman, who had come to request Mordecai's death, was forced to dress him in the king's robes, place him on the king's horse, and lead him through the streets, shouting his praises. As the people watched in amazement, Haman led the honor parade of the man he despised. Each step through the streets of Susa pierced his pride. The man who embodied everything Haman hated was now being celebrated as a national hero. What once seemed like injustice, delay, and silence became a stage for divine justice. After being honored, Mordecai returned to the palace gate. Humble as always, Haman ran home, humiliated and ashamed. When he told his wife and friends everything, Zeresh, his wife, spoke a prophetic word. "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Esther 6:13. As she finished speaking, the king's eunuchs arrived to escort Haman to Esther's second banquet, the banquet where his fate would be sealed. The second banquet had been carefully prepared by Esther. The table was full. The wine was served. The king was curious. Haman suspicious. But something was different. The atmosphere was no longer the same. Tension filled the air. Esther's smile hid a pain that burned in her chest, the pain of seeing her people condemned to death. King Xerxes, pleased, asked for the third time, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom." "It will be granted." Esther 7:2. This time she didn't delay. She didn't hesitate. She didn't hide. The moment had come. With a firm voice, eyes filled with emotion, and a courage born from fasting and prayer, Esther said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare the life of my people. This is my request." Esther 7:3. The king was shocked. "Save her life?" she continued, "for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." Esther 7:4. Xerxes stood up, confused and enraged. "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther 7:5. And Esther pointed. With dignity and firmness, she lifted her finger and revealed the adversary and enemy. "Is this vile Haman?" Esther 7:6. Haman froze. The king rose, filled with fury. The betrayal struck him like a spear. Haman, whom he had exalted, who wore the royal signet ring, who drank at his table, was the one trying to kill his own queen and her people. Xerxes stormed out into the palace garden, furious. Meanwhile, Haman threw himself on the couch where Esther was, begging for his life. The man who plotted genocide now pleaded for mercy from the woman he sought to destroy. The king returned and saw Haman collapsed on the queen's couch. He interpreted the act as an assault or an unspeakable offense. Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? Esther 7:8. Those words sealed Haman's fate. Immediately, the guards covered his face, a sign that he was to be executed. At that moment, one of the king's officials said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." Esther 7:9. Xerxes ordered, "Hang him on it." And so Haman was executed on the very gallows he had prepared for his enemy. Haman, who rose to the top of the empire with ambition and vanity, fell with violence and disgrace. He thought he would destroy the Jews, that he would eliminate Mordecai, that he would triumph with power. But he learned the bitter truth. God always has the final word, and when God chooses to reverse the roles, he does so publicly, justly, and decisively. Mordecai remained faithful. Esther took a risk, the people fasted, and heaven responded with a thunderous blow against the enemy. God did not shout. He did not appear in dreams. He did not send angels. But he moved the pieces with perfect precision. When it seems like nothing is happening, God is simply preparing the stage to act with glory. Sometimes our enemies rise up in strength, and it seems like all is lost. But the story of Haman shows us that no one can stop the plans of God. Every gallows built for the righteous can become the trap that catches the wicked themselves. But there was still a problem. The death decree against the Jews was still in effect. In Persia, no decree signed by the king could be revoked. How could a people be saved when they were condemned by the very law of the empire? In the next block, Esther's wisdom and Mordecai's authority will unite to rewrite history. After Haman's downfall, the palace seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But there was still a massive problem ahead. The decree for the annihilation of the Jews, sealed with the royal signet ring, was still in effect. According to Persian law, no official royal decree could be revoked, not even by the king himself. In other words, the death sentence still stood. The date of the massacre was drawing near. The people were still at risk. It was as if the victory over Haman had only been the first battle. The real war was still to come. Esther once again approached the king, but this time not with fear. She came as a queen, an intercessor, and a defender of her people. She fell at the king's feet, weeping, and pleaded, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman devised to destroy the Jews." Esther 8:5. Xerxes then offered the possible solution. "Now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring." Esther 8:8. And he gave full authority to Esther and Mordecai to create a new decree. Mordecai, now exalted to a position of authority in the kingdom, with the king's ring on his finger, wrote a new decree that on the day appointed for the massacre, the Jews in all provinces were granted permission to defend themselves. They could unite, protect their families, retaliate against attacks, and destroy anyone who sought to kill them. The Jews in every city were allowed to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force that might attack them. Esther 8:11. Copies of the decree were sent throughout the empire, in every language. The new decree brought hope and courage to a people who had been preparing to die. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. Esther 8:16. In every city and province where the new decree arrived, the Jews began to celebrate, gather, and grow stronger. And something extraordinary happened. Many among the peoples of the empire became sympathetic to the Jews, for they saw the hand of God upon them. Finally, the day appointed in the old decree arrived, the 13th day of the month of Adar. The enemies of the Jews armed themselves to attack, but the Jews were ready, united, strengthened, and authorized to fight. In every province, they triumphed. The officials, governors, and even the soldiers began to respect them, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon all. In Susa, the capital of the empire, the Jews killed 500 enemies, including Haman's 10 sons. The next day, at Esther's request, the bodies of the sons were hung on the gallows, as a symbol that justice had been served. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did what they pleased. To those who hated them. Esther 9-5. Across the empire, the people of God prevailed, not by strength, not by numbers, but by a divine decree, fulfilled through Esther's faithfulness, Mordecai's courage, and the eternal covenant with the God of Israel. After the great victory, Mordecai wrote to all the Jews throughout the empire, instituting a new celebration, that the days of the 14th and 15th of the month of Adar should be celebrated each year as the days when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy. Esther 9:21-22. This celebration was called Purim, derived from the word pur, the lot that Haman cast to choose the day of the massacre. The very fate that the enemy used to destroy was turned into a living memory of deliverance. Purim became a feast of joy, the exchange of gifts, helping the needy, and gratitude for God's faithfulness. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, prominent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Esther 10:3. The man who refused to bow was now honored throughout the empire, and God, who seemed silent in the beginning, now had his name exalted through the story, the salvation, and the faithfulness of his people. God doesn't just deliver. He turns pain into celebration, mourning into dancing, a sentence into a testimony, and what began as a story of exile, fear, and genocide became a legacy, a declaration of faith, and a celebration of divine victory. The book of Esther teaches us that there is no silence that God cannot fill with glory, and that his purpose will never be frustrated, even if it takes time, even if it passes through crosses and gallows. The story has ended, but what is it still speaking to you? In this final block, a deep reflection. What have we learned from Esther? How can we live today with the same courage, wisdom, and faith as this woman who changed the destiny of a nation? The book of Esther began without God's name, without prophets, without visible miracles, without supernatural manifestations. Yet, it was one of the greatest acts of deliverance in biblical history. Why? Because God's actions don't depend on how visibly he appears, but on how willing we are to trust him even when he seems hidden. Esther was not a warrior. She wasn't a priestess. She wasn't a prophetess. She was an orphan, raised by her cousin, who learned to listen, to wait, to fast, to observe, and to surrender. She didn't win battles with swords. She won with silence, wisdom, prayer, and courage. What made her a heroine was not her position. It was her total surrender to God. God's silence does not mean absence. Even when there are no signs, no visions, no immediate answers, he is working. Esther teaches us to trust heaven's backstage. Every position is a calling, no matter where you are, at work, in the family, in a time of crisis, or a time of peace. If God placed you there, there's a greater purpose than you can imagine. Courage is not the absence of fear. Esther was afraid, but she chose to act in spite of fear. Courage is obedience, even with risk, even without guarantees. Fasting and prayer precede favor. Before facing the king, she faced heaven. In fasting, she knew victory didn't come from strategy, but from dependence on God. Every gallows built for the righteous can turn against the one who built it. Haman fell into his own trap. The enemy may make plans, but God has the final word. Maybe you feel like Esther at the beginning, without a place, a purpose, or a voice. But God says to you, I've placed you exactly where you are for such a time as this. Maybe you feel like Mordecai, faithful but forgotten. And God replies, the reward is coming. I never forget those who serve me. Maybe you feel surrounded like the Jews in the Persian provinces, and the Spirit says to you, fast, pray, believe, because the day marked for your fall will be the day of your victory. Purim is not just a celebration. It is a living memory that God reverses decrees, that He transforms casting lots into salvation, silence into answers, orphans into royalty, sackcloth into royal robes. May Purim happen in your home. May mourning be turned into dancing. May the sentence be annulled. May the enemy be silenced. May God appear, even if it's behind the scenes. Today, God is looking for new Esthers, men and women willing to say, if I perish, but I will not stay silent. People who intercede, who fast, who stand in the gap. People who do not run from their time. People who understand they were called for such a time as this. If this story touched your heart, comment below. I am here for the time God has called me. Share this video with someone who is fighting in silence and needs to be reminded that God never abandons His own. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click the Knowing the Word channel button now, turn on the bell, and keep diving with us into the most powerful, soul-stirring stories of the Bible told with truth, spirit, and power.